Hello and welcome to the American Council on Exercise live webinars continuing education series. My name is Dr. Jackie Crockford. I'm very excited to be your host once again today for our live events. Before we get started, just a few announcements from ACE. We now have our ACE Pro Compass. This is a great portion of our website dedicated to you, the ACE certified professionals. You can go there and it's a place for you to help yourself navigate your business, your goals in the health and fitness industry. So head on over to compass.acefitness.org and there will be very curated content, especially made for you, that includes some great challenges for you to help navigate yourself through the health and fitness industry. Also new to ACE is the ACE Job Board. This is a great place for you to apply and connect with potential employers. You can apply for jobs, upload your resume, and connect social media accounts so that you can find the career that you want. So that is found at careers.acefitness.org. You can head on over there as well. And lastly, before we get started with our live event today, remember, if you are an ACE certified professional, we do now have the ACE Pro Connect app. This is a great place for you to connect, learn, and grow with other ACE certified professionals. There is new content uploaded on the regular, so feel free to download that app, and that is free for you on your Android or iOS or device. All right, before we get started, let's go over a few logistics so that you can have a great learning experience. Once again, you are watching today for free via YouTube, so take a look at your YouTube viewer. You should see a chat bar there. You can use that chat bar at any time. Feel free to say hello to me. I'll be monitoring that chat as we go through today's live session. As well, you can type in your questions for our presenter, who I will be introducing shortly. Feel free to use that chat bar at any time. Also, because you are watching today for free, no continuing education credits are awarded, but today we are presenting live part one of this course. And if you go to the link provided on your screen after today's webinar, that's acefitness.org/past webinars, you can purchase the recorded version of today's session along with a bonus hour of content. Once you pass the quiz associated with those 2 hours of content, you'll receive 0.2 CECs. That's 2 hours of CECs within your My ACE account. And we'll talk more about how to earn those CECs at the end of today's live event. Okay, if you're ready for your course, let's get started. Welcome to your course, Improving Performance Through Breathwork. My name is Dr. Jackie Crockford. I'm excited to be your host for this course today, and joining me is our presenter, Michelle Dalcourt. Hi, Michelle.
Hey, Jackie, how are you?
Good, doing well. Welcome back to ACE.
It's good to be here. Thank you, and thanks everyone at ACE for hosting us.
Yes, of course. So, Michelle, you are the CEO, founder of the Institute of Motion.
Right.
Hopefully everyone knows that by now, but tell us a little bit about what you've sort of been doing over the last, I don't know, couple of years. Sure. As our industry has paused for a bit.
Yeah, so certainly, leading up to the pandemic and then over the course of the pandemic, Jackie, we were always framing ourselves to look at health and human performance. And we're going to talk about that today. How do we challenge ourselves? How do we be intentional when we think about fitness and wellness, and what are those attributes? And so we really honed in on the idea of what is health? What determines our health beyond just the physical? And how does that shape what we do, the strategies that we look at, how we coach individuals, and certainly what we bring to bear in terms of services and offerings? And so over the past couple of years, it really has focused our particular offerings and what we have as solutions in the space of what we call health and human performance, and we apply that for folks. And so in our discussion today about breath work, we're going to touch on the idea of performance and certainly on the idea of health as well.
Wonderful. And we know performance, as we're kind of alluding to, can be a variety of things, right? We can think about that in a couple of different ways.
It absolutely can. Yeah, we can look at it from the perspective of performance as it relates to life performance, right? So if I'm in my working years and I want to navigate a good experience of life, that's life performance. Athletic performance, obviously we all know what that means. But then there's always this kind of health baseline that we want to make sure that we adhere to. And so performance could mean a variety of different things across the life stages, even for organizations, Jackie, right? Organizations are looking for well-being as well, but it means a lot to them in a slightly different context than it may mean for you and I as individuals.
Right, so we've got a lot to talk about today. We ready to get started?
Great.
All right.
All right, thanks, Jackie. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Appreciate you jumping on this live webinar. I'm excited to be able to present to you the information around improving performance through breath work. And as I alluded to with Jackie before, the idea here is that we want to look at performance not just from the athletic outcome, but certainly from the health and life performance. Can we actually facilitate a good outcome of physiology? And can we practice certain things intentionally as exercise strategies, as programming strategies, in order for us to be successful in relation to coaching an individual through an experience of health and human performance? So with that, the learning objectives for part one are 3 in nature. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to describe the physiology of respiration to create a foundation of understanding. I like learning about the mechanisms of the body. I've always enjoyed learning about the mechanisms of the body. So physiology, anatomy, function, for me has always been very appealing. So for me, part one is exciting. And I want to translate that to you as we think about what respiration actually is. What is the outcome? And physiology is pretty brilliant. You know, Jackie and I were talking off camera a lot about magic today. And there is a lot of this magic as it relates to physiological outcomes. The body has a series of what are called redundancies. And think of this as backup systems. So respiration, getting air in and out, is one thing. But the action of doing that, as we're about to see, has all these different kind of peripheral cascading effects physiologically that are very useful for health and performance. And that's going to be part of the narrative. So I want to go through that as a learning objective for number one. The second learning objective is really about learning about the muscles, perhaps the nerves as well, and the mechanisms of muscles that are created and are responsible for both inspiration and expiration. The reason why that's important is because the task of breathing, if you look at it through the muscular lens, is to get air in and out. But the idea of preparation, the idea of core stability, the idea of mechanical support, the idea of motor control, all of these things that are a bedrock of our foundation of function are nested within nerve muscle actions and these peripheral things to respiration. So learning about the nerves and the muscles that control inspiration and expiration are going to give us a window into what really is important as it relates to motor control, as it relates to proximal stability of the spine, the trunk, the core, as it were. And these are very useful things as it relates to performance, as it relates to preparation, warm-ups, that sort of idea. It's really going to inform part two when we learn about these things. The third is going to be exploring the mechanics of breath work so that we can better understand stability and motor control. I'm going to talk about the respiration mechanism as it relates to the internal organs, as it relates to the heart, as it relates to the function and the chemistry of the blood. And this goes kind of beyond just, hey, we're training breathing, which is true, but we need to understand it as a baseline of, wow, this really is important as an attribute of health and as an attribute of human performance. And so for us to explore part one together is all about the exploration of these many mechanisms, why they're important, and how they inform an intentional strategy. Because I've said this before, these are game-changing things. And I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but when we start to invite these strategies, what we will call respiratory muscle training, we're going to take a look at that in part two. When we start to introduce these aspects into our understanding and into our practice, when we coach others and ourselves, they really are game-changing because they prepare the body in ways in which are very task-driven. they're very authentic, and our bodies can self-organize efficiencies based upon that, and that serves as a good foundation of health and human performance. So let's get going and let's look at part one. We're looking here at the breathing mechanics. A lot of times people ask me, breathing, isn't that just, you breathe one way, you breathe in and out, and that's it? And my response to that is always the same, which is, if we're physiologically ready, if we're preparing ourselves, others, to be really physiologically ready, to be unbreakable, to have the capacity to do things, we're going to think about a wide variety of elements that we can do. We're big fans of the concept of variability, right? Giving variable inputs to a biological system, me, is going to create inputs that my body has to account for. And the way it gets better, the way it adapts, is through that process of introducing all of these different inputs, getting the body to respond and to adjust accordingly. Then it adapts, it supercompensates, it creates tolerances, it creates this I'm accustomed to it scenarios where I can take all these inputs and they don't rattle my system. So to that end, what we would say is learn or teach your body a variety of different ways to breathe. And that is going to build capacity in terms of physiological normal. And if we can introduce a broader range of physiological normal, that's better. An example of this that is not really seen in training for good reason, but it's seen in life that I want to walk you through, is this notion of breathing that is self-organized by the body. So I grew up in a farm in Canada. And on that farm, particularly in the summer months, my brother and I had to do a lot of chores on the farm. So imagine if I'm back on the farm as a youngster, and one of my chores, I hated this day because we had to do it, it was picking rocks, because we had to go in the field and picking rocks because it would get in the way of all of the machinery, all the farm machinery, and it would damage the machinery. So we had to go pick rocks. Terrible. It's as bad as it sounds. And as we did that, sometimes there were small rocks, sometimes there were bigger rocks. And what was interesting about that is, without me consciously even being aware of this, I was just navigating activities of daily living, chores. And when I picked up the smaller rocks as a youngster, I would put them in the wagon, and my physiology didn't really change that much. It didn't really adjust that much. It wasn't a big imposition of stress. But sometimes, just sometimes, there was a bigger rock or bigger boulder on the farm. And it was so big that you had to navigate. You had to crouch down. You had to get yourself in a bodily position that would accommodate stability. So your body self-organized that task. And then if the rock was heavy enough, you would actually hold your breath. And that physiologically is called a Valsalva maneuver. And you would hold your breath enough to create stability and motor control to be able to lift the rock up off the dirt and then put it in the wagon wherever the wagon was. And if you reflect, or if I reflect back on this, it's interesting to see how the body self-organized that task, because it chose that particular strategy to hold its breath to create more stability, because it needed it because the weight was heavier. And that is all self-organized, but if I wasn't used to it yet, my body would get rattled. I might get postural hypotension, so that vasovagal reflex would maybe come into bear, and I would get dizzy. And a lot of us have done that before. We get postural hypotension. We're not used to it. And I would say this just as a qualifier. In forms of traditional training and our training approach, we don't hold our breath because we're not lifting the rock once like on the farm. We're doing set and rep schemes which require, repetition. And if I was to hold my breath the whole time, that would be that at a disadvantage to my outcome of performance. So breathing techniques in lifting mechanics have kind of altered this. They say don't hold your breath. You're going to charge these cavities and then kind of slowly let the air out, but continue that cycle of breathing, just slow it down. These are good strategies. And so we want to learn different ways to breathe to create readiness. So with that as a backdrop, let's uncover the breathing mechanics, some of the physiology and anatomy of breathing, so that we can take a clear sense and a view in terms of how we can intentionally approach our training. So at its most basic form, respiration is basically bringing air from the atmosphere into our lungs and then returning it back to the atmosphere. And the primary reason why we do this is for gas exchange, right? So we want to take oxygen from the atmosphere into our lungs. To do that, we've got to create a lower volume in terms of our lungs than the atmosphere, right? So to do that, I would expand the space within this cavity here, the thoracic cavity. And as I expand that space, there is now a lower volume, a lower air pressure inside my lungs. And by virtue of a pressure gradient, air rushes in from the atmosphere into my lungs. When I expire, I start to close the space within my lungs, right? All my muscles and everything else either return back to normal or they contract to close the space within my lungs. Now there's a higher pressure inside my lungs compared to the atmosphere. There's a lower pressure and air rushes out based on pressure gradients. And so by virtue of that, we bring oxygen in and we exhale CO2 to get rid of carbon dioxide and other metabolites, other toxins, and that exchange of respiration occurs systematically in my lungs. And then once I get oxygen in, it's transported to the blood, it gets to the level of the cell where cellular respiration takes place, and that's, again, the utilization of oxygen at a cell level. But cellular respiration can't start without system respiration. So we do this, and it's an exchange, and we do this about 20 to 23,000 times a day. Now, biology is phenomenal, right? We always talk about magic, right? It's magical. And if something's being done with that much frequency, right, 20,000 to 23,000 times a day, there is going to be some other benefits that the body takes advantage of because of the frequency. We're going to talk about that later on, right? But at first, we're going to talk about the mechanisms to get air in and out to create that gas exchange. So if we look at the respiratory system, it's made up of a bunch of different structures, right? In order for us to take a look at these structures, obviously we can get air in through the nose, we can get air in through the mouth, and as air enters into the body through those two access points, it goes to the pharynx. Now the pharynx is a tube, right? And that tube is here to transport from these cavities, the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, in through the pharynx, and then it goes down this tube in through the throat. Now, the epiglottis, which is basically a cap, it can switch from tube to tube, right? So it's at the level of the pharynx. There's an epiglottis. Now, if I'm eating food and I want food to go through the digestive tract, the epiglottis will close the larynx and the windpipe. And that way it doesn't allow food to enter in, obviously, to the lungs. Equally, if I'm breathing air in and out through the oral cavity, my mouth, or my nose, the epiglottis is going to close the digestive tube, the tract, and air will rush into the larynx and in through the trachea and down in through the lungs. So through the nasal cavity, through the oral cavity, to the to the pharynx, and then that epiglottis, if it opens up and allows air to rush into the respiratory system, it goes to the larynx. Now the larynx has a covering in front of it to protect it, and that is the thyroid cartilage, which is basically in front. And through the larynx, it comes down into the bronchi, into the bronchioles. Those have a lot of mucous membranes in it, which protect against immune response. Also, it has a bunch of macrophages that go and attack foreign particles. So it's a protective mechanism, that mucous membrane. And then it goes to the level of the lungs, and I'll talk about how that gas exchange occurs. So if we look at the upper part of this system, the upper respiratory system, what we look at is the idea of the oral cavity, which is not listed there, and the nasal cavity. And I really want to hone in onto the nasal cavity because there is a lot of talk about nasal breathing and the value of nasal breathing. Of course, we can breathe through the mouth, and that's not as advantageous. So I'm going to give you four actually, elements of nasal breathing that could be beneficial for us as individuals. The first thing is when we take air in through the nose, the shape of the anatomy of the nose, the bony structures of the nose, create a turbulent airflow. So what happens is as air enters into the nose, Because of the structure of all the bones internal to the nose, it starts to spin the air. And when it spins the air, turbulent airflow moves quicker. Just like think of a turbine to an airplane. As soon as it hits the turbine, it starts to spin faster, move faster. And turbulent airflow, as it spins into the level of the nose, will go down the pharynx, down the larynx, into the level of the lungs. And as it's moving, it favors better gas exchange at the alveoli level, right? So the alveoli is in the lungs and it captures oxygen and it exchanges that for CO2. And that exchange can happen at the level of the lung. But if air enters into the lung and is moving quicker, then there's a better opportunity for gas exchange to occur. So what's pretty brilliant about the nose anatomy is if you look at the bony structures, it'll spin the air, turbulent airflow. That's advantageous for better gas exchange. The next thing is that it cleans the air. So there are cilia, they're hair, we have hair in our nose, and when air enters our nose, there's particulate matter, there's oxygen, there's all the stuff that enters with it in the air. And one of the ways in which our body can filter it is many. It can filter it through the mucus at the level of the lungs, at the level of the bronchi and the bronchioles, but also as a first interface. As it enters into the nose, we've got hair, and that hair can interrupt the airflow to certain degrees. It'll move it quicker and spin it as well, but that hair can also capture some particulate matter. So aesthetically, we all know that we like to clean the nose and make sure there's no hair in there, but there is an advantage functionally to having that in the nose. So the next time I see you on the street, if I'm ever in front of you, you can keep a nice bouquet of hair. I'm just kidding. But it is functional to the body, and it is something that is useful in terms of anatomy. The next thing is it heats the air. So back in my undergrad studies, I remember some profs that I had citing research of dogs running in cold temperatures. And these dogs were on a treadmill in the cold, and they had a temperature gauge in 4 inches inside the dog's nose. Now, most canines, not all, most breeds of canines have a long nose. And so in that space, in that nose space, the length of the nose, the air can heat up. And in this particular study, they had dogs running in minus 100 degrees Celsius, which would be, 140, minus 140 Fahrenheit perhaps. And that was the outside air temperature. 4 inches inside their nose, the air temperature was already 20 degrees Celsius, which is around 70 plus or minus degrees Fahrenheit. So in that space of 4 inches, that air heated up. And for us to be able to assimilate things, either food, air in this case, we want to make sure that it comes into the body and is at a state where it's towards homeostasis of our body. So if we're breathing air in and it's cold, to assimilate it, it has to heat up. And so one of the functions of the nose and nasal breathing is that it can heat up the air so that it's more consistent with our internal environment so that that air can be assimilated with more efficiency. So one of those things that is part of the efficiency mechanisms of the body, in this case of the respiratory mechanism. The last thing that's not listed there, but I wanted to mention it, was that in the paranasal sinuses, these structures, these sinuses, these cavities within our nasal structure, there's also nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is a gas, and it's a vasodilator, and that gas, nitric oxide, is also linked with angiotensin, which angiotensin is a signaling molecule that affects smooth muscle contraction of our vasculature, of our arteries, our arterioles in the cardiovascular system, our vessels. So if angiotensin is expressed, it can create vasoconstriction. So think of your garden hose as being constricted or dilated, and each of those will either get more fluid in quicker, like if you constrict it, it moves faster, and if it's dilated, it moves slower, and that's associated with performance and blood pressure for health as well. So nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So at rest, during normal functions of life, if we're just living our lives and we're not in a fight or flight exercise or athletic response state, we kind of want to express a little bit of vasodilation to control blood pressure, because during exercise, blood pressure goes up, as it should. During exercise and athletic performance, blood pressure goes up as it should. So those vessels begin to constrict based on the fight or flight sympathetic response. But nitric oxide, when you breathe through the nose, creates vasodilation. It also communicates with this renin-angiotensin system, which controls blood pressure as well. And so that's a nice byproduct, health-wise, of nasal breathing. We get bathed with nitric oxide. That's a useful thing, right? So there is advantage to breathing through the nose as opposed to breathing through the mouth. I'll just say this, particularly when we inspire air. It's not as demonstrative when we expire air, but certainly when we take air in, it's important. So that's nasal breathing. And then, as I said before, it goes through the pharynx, down in through the larynx, and the epiglottis would open up the larynx to allow air to come in. And that's part of our upper respiratory system. The lower respiratory system, after it goes through the larynx, it goes in through the windpipe, down to the bronchioles. As I said before, a lot of mucus in the bronchioles and the bronchi. And as it gets to the level of the bronchioles, these are like the leaves at the end of the tree branches. So you've got a tree trunk, right, which is your trachea. It breaks off into the first divisions of branches, which is, let's say, your bronchi. And then the bronchioles are the little branches that come off the main branches. And the leaves at the end, we'll call that the alveoli. And the alveoli is where you have the gas exchange. That's where oxygen can be assimilated by the lungs, taken up by the blood, right? When you think about pulmonary circulation within the heart. So the left ventricle starts to pump out unoxygenated blood to the lungs. It comes back as oxygenated blood to the left atrium. That is pulmonary circulation within the heart. So heart sends blood to the lungs, comes back as oxygenated blood to the left atrium. The left ventricle then receives it and pumps it out into the system as oxygenated blood. Really important. So that level of exchange there is going to be critically important. Lung function, ventilatory function, efficiencies in the breathing apparatus are hugely determinant of health. Now we might say, yeah, but I'm young, I'm healthy. Better health, better performance. Better health, I can challenge myself to a greater degree. Better health, better baseline to build tolerance up against stressors, against life. We can deal with more. And so these things are going to be important as it relates to performance, but they're certainly going to be critically important as it relates to health and health outcomes. The last two things there, we've got a cavity, a cage around the lower respiratory system, which is the thoracic cage. That's housed with a bunch of different muscles, which I'll talk about in a second. They are primarily stability-based muscles. So in order for us to engage them is going to be to understand the nerve-muscle connection to the spine, to the core, to the thoracic cage. All that's going to be vitally important as it relates to core stability. Of course, the main breathing muscle is the respiratory diaphragm. And the respiratory diaphragm needs helpers, right? There's big conversation as to we want to use the respiratory diaphragm as the main breathing muscle. Agreed. But there are certain times that we want to spare the respiratory diaphragm by calling all the helpers of the diaphragm out. And we're going to explore that a little later on in this conversation today, and how we can, what's called diaphragmatic sparing, how we can spare the diaphragm. It means we still use it. It still means it's the main breathing muscle, but we build efficiencies within the respiratory diaphragm. And that's going to be key, and that's going to be one of the functions of respiratory muscle training, which is going to be part 2. So if we look at the accessory systems to respiration, we think about now, what are the elements linked? What are the structures and the systems that are linked to respiration? Well, 2 of the major ones are, as I said before, the nervous system, and then the other one is the muscular system. We're going to look at both here in just a moment in great detail. But what I find fascinating about the respiratory system, it's one of the fastest ways in which we can access parts of our nervous system that control either fight or flight or rest and digest. So fight or flight is known as the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is a part of the nervous system that wires itself towards arousal or a high state of anticipation or exercise. So it's getting ready to do something, right? So your heart rate will go up. Your blood will preferentially be shunt to the muscles and not to your viscera, not to your internal organs. Your pupils will dilate, which means they get bigger, which means I want to let more information in, right? So a person that's getting ready for exercise or under arousal or stress, their pupils are going to dilate, their heart rate's going to go up, their blood pressure is going to go up, they're going to start to sweat. All of that is a function of the sympathetic division. The opposite, or I shouldn't say the opposite, what keeps it in balance is the parasympathetic division of the nervous system. And that's all about rest and digest. That's all about I'm just going to relax, the blood pressure is going to come down, the heart rate's going to come down, my pupils are going to constrict, the blood is not going to go to the muscles anymore, it's going to go to the viscera so I can digest my food. All of these things are operating in balance. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, sympathetic, parasympathetic. And what's interesting about the respiration or the respiratory system is if you influence breath and breath training, it is a direct link into both of those aspects of the nervous system, which is critically important. The other one is the muscular system, as we're going to look at. We're going to look at inspiratory muscles and expiratory muscles. So muscles that are involved in taking air in, inspiration, and muscles that are involved in pushing air out, expiration. And they're a completely different set of muscles. So we can train them both, and we should, so that we can build capacity and motor control and core stability within each of these sets of muscles that we're going to take a look at. So first, to the nervous system. I expressed that respiration can have a direct link into the nervous system. A lot of times when we think about breath work, right, the topic of this webinar is improving performance through breath work. There is an inherent assumption that breath work only means, and we actually kind of funnily, we see it in the pictures here as well, which are great pictures, but it's always of, I'm resting and I'm practicing breath work. Yes, that's only one phase though, right? What we're trying to do is to say, can we do some recovery breathing? How would we do that? Typically it's through the nose. Typically it's at a slower cadence and a ratio. Typically it's a 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 ratio of inspiration to expiration, meaning if I take a breath in for 4 seconds, I hold it for 2 seconds, I let it out for 8 seconds, right? It's 4 in, 8 out. So there's kind of that 1-to-2 ratio. That ratio is going to be very consistent with bringing about a restful state to the body, because breathing can directly access the nervous system's division of the, in this case, parasympathetic tone, right? The idea of rest and digest. And that's great. And we do that all the time, and it should be practiced by virtue of a recovery strategy. The flip side is also true, though. We can actually train breathing, respiratory muscle training, to activate sympathetic modalities, sympathetic tone. We can activate efficiencies in elevated breathing so that efficiencies can correspond to an output of performance gain. And I don't mean just athletic performance, although that is true too. I mean life performance. Can we do both of those equations? Can we do the restful state of breathing? Can we do the arousal state of breathing? And if we can, we're building capacity. We're building a broad base of tolerance and adaptation within the body. And so we access these types of things, where we can access both divisions. The main nerve to the breathing apparatus is the phrenic nerve and the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and if we stimulate it with a low amplitude, a pacing that is slower, we can increase what's called vagal tone. And vagal tone is this idea of parasympathetic dominance. It really gets us, in a restful state. And we even see this, right now the basketball playoffs are on, right? And you'll see a critical shot in the free throw, right? So let's say it's late in the game, the player, they're down by 2, and the player gets fouled. He can sink 2 buckets to tie the game. Big pressure. What do? They typically dribble. They wait for a moment. What do? They breathe out, right? To center themselves. to get themselves from that high arousal state to a lower state of arousal so they can actually create a little bit more motor control and get the job done, right? So breathing through the phrenic and through the vagus nerve has a direct impact into that conversation with the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. So it's very impactful and very powerful. To the muscular system, we're going to look at two strategies. We're going to look at a series of muscles that aid in inspiration. Now remember, accessory breathing muscles are primarily stability muscles. So I'll say that again. Accessory breathing muscles, the one that help with labored breathing, either breathing air out or in, are primarily stability muscles. They're type 1, they're slow to fatigue, they enhance stability. So if we know this and we know that we're task-based people, like our muscles are task-based, the idea of inspiration is going to call upon all of these muscles. Now we know the first one there is the respiratory diaphragm. The main meat breathing muscle, it is a dome at the base of our rib cage. Under rest, it's usually dome is up, so it's pushed up. But as it contracts, it actually contracts to flatten out. And when it flattens out, it pulls the lungs apart and creates more of a lower volume so that air can rush in. So it creates space, right? So it has to get out of the way, it has to come down. So that is the main breathing muscle, the respiratory diaphragm, hugely important. We also have muscles like the pectoralis major and minor. The pectoralis minor lifts the rib cage. Now again, we want to create space if we're thinking about inspiration, bringing air in. So the diaphragm pulls down, the pectoralis minor lifts up. Now, but the pectoralis minor goes from the upper 3 ribs to the coracoid process of our shoulder blade. So we think, so not only does it help us with breathing because it lifts the rib cage, but now it's connected to our shoulder blade. So it enhances shoulder blade stability. Well, that's helpful for my arm and for my upper body movements, for throwing, for crawling around, for performing a task in the gym, for performing a task athletically or in life. Shoulder stability is going to be important. So now I can access this muscle. Interesting. The next one is the serratus anterior. Now the serratus anterior goes from the spinous processes of your spine. So basically the bones that you can feel sticking out posteriorly from your spine, it starts there. It goes laterally to the medial border of your shoulder blade. So think the inside part of your shoulder blade. And then it goes deep to your shoulder blade, wraps around your rib cage from back all the way into the front, attaches to the ribs in front, and then starts to become your internal and external obliques as it crosses over and down to the opposite hip. So that entire myofascial line, the anatomy of the serratus anterior and the fascia to the abdominal wall, connects your shoulder blade, your spine, then your shoulder blades, then your ribs, then the abdominal wall, then your opposite hip. It is a corset that goes all the way from your spine to your shoulder blades around to your front of your hips through the abdominal wall. So now, if we're thinking about that being active, it controls shoulder blade stability and control, rib cage, abdominal wall, pelvis. That's a pretty good deal, right, with that one strand of muscle and fascia. So that serape, that corset that wraps around, can be facilitated by inspiration exercises, inspiring air and getting air into the body, critically important. And we also have the levator costarum, and those are in the back. They're paraspinal muscles. These are muscles around. Para means around the spine itself. They link each adjacent vertebral body together, as well as the transversospinalis. These are all small muscles within the spine itself that do two things. When they contract, they will stiffen the spine. They will create segmental spinal stability or segmental spinal control. That's a really good thing. What they also do is when they're trained, they also give feedback to the nervous system quicker. So they provide more, not just motor control, they can just contract and control the spine, but they provide more sensory information because they're trained. And so the transversospinalis, the serratus posterior superior, these are paraspinal muscles that are critically important for control, right? Motor control, which is I'm sending information to the nervous system, and then I'm contracting to stabilize the spine. Critically important. Hard to do consciously, right? I bet you that individuals cannot contract these muscles consciously, just like most individuals want to warm up the glutes, let's say for themselves or their clients, which is great. And they want to get their clients or themselves to consciously contract their glutes, which is okay. It's very hard for us to control these small muscles. However, these small muscles, critically important because that is proximal stability. They are type 1. They are slow to fatigue. How do you get them to contract? You train breathing. And you train breathing, and the benefit that you get is better core. The last two, the sternocleidomastoid and scalenes, are in the neck, right? So during the pandemic, and a lot of folks adopted the computer posture. They normally do that anyway, even before the pandemic, but certainly because of the pandemic too. And our neck, shifted its position relative to the thoracic spine. And these two muscles, the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes, when we inspire air, they will function, they will train, they will improve, they will get efficient and stronger to control the cervical spine, which is part of the spine. And it's a forgotten part of the spine, but it's critically important as well. So these muscles are all associated with taking air in. Forcing air out is the other realm of the spectrum, and it's a complete different set of muscles. Now, what's interesting about the list of muscles here is what you don't see is the respiratory diaphragm. It is not involved at all in pushing air out of the body. It actually can relax during this phase, and that's a good thing. Because muscles that can contract and relax, build efficiency. So if we can index on or focus on intentionally the inspiring phase of training and also right here the expiring phase, blowing air out, of training, we're going to create a relaxation in the respiratory diaphragm. And that's going to be important, as I'm going to share later. But for right now, expiration muscles, the abdominal wall, all 4 layers of the abdominal wall, when we blow air out, and we're going to practice it in part 2, in certain positions. When we blow air out, everything squeezes tight. Why? Because we got to create a higher pressure in here to force air out into the atmosphere. So to create a higher pressure, everything sinks in. What helps to do that is the diaphragm, or excuse me, the abdominal muscles, right? All 4 layers, rectus abdominis, the internal external obliques, the transverse abdominis in through, because it connects to the thoracolumbar fascia, which is a thick band of connective tissue in the small of your back. All of that cinches tight, as well as the pelvic floor, which is your pelvic diaphragm, not your respiratory diaphragm, the pelvic diaphragm. In the base of your pelvis resides 4 muscles, and they're called the levator ani group. Right? It's a group of 4 muscles that is in the pelvic basin. Not only does it stabilize your sacrum, not only does it stabilize your pelvis, it helps control for your bowel movements, right? And as we get older, lack of motor control can lead to incontinence. So there is a performance and a health conversation to this. So pelvic diaphragm, critically important. It contracts, it pulls up and keeps the base of our pelvis strong as our abdominal wall becomes strong, putting tension on the thoracolumbar fascia, which, by the way, the lat and the glute anchor into. So that whole system self-serves itself by creating what Stuart McGill might call super stiffness, right? They all serve each other to become stiff because they're all anchoring into another element that's stiff, right? Because they stiffen together. And that's the value of training this system as a system. We're not just training an isolated muscle that's going to get strong on its own. We're training a system that when muscles get strong together, they can anchor into each other to become super strong. And that's the idea. So from the abdominal wall to the pelvic diaphragm to the transversus thoracis. So that starts at your sternum and it kind of radiates laterally and kind of posteriorly as it wraps around the ribs. And that provides rib cage stability, which is going to be critically important for overall thoracic stability and ultimately cervical and lumbar stability too. We're creating stability in this system with muscles that are close to the joint. From there, we think of the QL. The quadratus lumborum attaches your bottom ribs to your pelvis, right? And so that becomes part of this innate proximal stability mechanism that we have to connect rib cage from pelvis. And if we can do that well, then our rib cage and pelvis can connect to each other. That's where we have stability. And by the way, that's where we can protect the lumbar spine. If our rib cage and our pelvis are not really connected to each other, there's a lot of movement between them, let's say. What's in the middle is your lumbar spine. It has to move too much. It's not designed to move that much. So the discs of your lumbar spine start to move too much because there's relative motion in the lumbar spine, and that's where we wear out the disc in time. So performance conversation, yeah. Health conversation, yeah. And so we want those connections to be the case. The serratus posterior inferior, again, it's a paraspinal structure. It helps support the lumbar spine and the thoracic spine. And then the last one is the intercostals. The intercostals, just like our ungular rings of our discs of our spine, they're wound in two separate directions. So the external intercostals and the internal intercostals are wound in a crisscross format, about 45 degrees relative to each other. So if you've got the binding and weaving of structure that is oriented in a crisscross manner, that creates a lot of support. And so these intercostals have a lot and provide a lot of rib cage, thoracic spine support and stability. So we're going to be training these things, and that becomes important as it relates to the intention of training for fitness and wellness in sport and performance of life. Other considerations to respiration. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are other characteristics that are fascinating. The first one is mechanical, right? So if I was to, let's say, do a squat, and I've got a bar on my back, and I've got a lot of weight relative to what I can do, and I'm going to go through that squat pattern down and up, what I want to do is I want to create as much stability as possible. So muscles will be recruited for stability, but I can also call upon pressure in cavities in my body to also assist my muscles to create stability. And one of the ways in which we do this is to charge the thoracic cavity and to charge the abdominal cavity. And what I mean by that is if I was to take air in and hold it in my lungs, that's pneumatic air pressure. That's air mechanical pressure, just like inflating a balloon. The more I inflate it to a point, the more stable it gets, the more stability, mechanical stability it can house. So I'm charging these to the lungs, the thoracic cavity, by taking air in. Now what's kind of cool about this is that will support my rib cage and my thoracic spine to be sure. But to get air in, remember what the respiratory diaphragm has to do. It has to create volume. So it has to push down to create more space here so the air can rush in. When it does that, it pushes on what's called the peritoneum. And the peritoneum is a sac around your guts. And that sac around your guts is under pressure. So when we do cadaver dissections, and we cut through the abdominal wall and we get to the layer of the sac around your organs. It's like a balloon around your organs. It's under pressure. Because when you make an incision on the peritoneum, you can hear air escape. And it's under about 22 pounds of meaning within, intra-abdominal pressure. And that visceral content under pressure, the peritoneum, the parietal peritoneum and the peritoneum, which is the sac around your guts, as the diaphragm pushes down, it pushes against the sac around your organs. Just like if I took a balloon and I was inflated, and I took it and it was closed, so it was an inflated balloon, and I put it between my hands and I pushed down on it, you're going to pressurize it to a greater degree. Now, if I took that balloon and I pushed down on it, where are the borders of that balloon going to go? They're going to go in every direction. And as they go in every direction, that's when we push our belly button out, that's exactly what is happening. Our diaphragm is pushing against our organs, and our organs are pushing our belly button out. And you see this in infants all the time in diapers with no shirt on, running around. And when they're breathing, you just see their belly going in and out and in and out. And that's exquisite motor control or actions or function of the diaphragm in the respiratory apparatus of that young individual. So as I push against that sac in our guts, called the peritoneum, it creates stability, or hoop tension, functional stability around the trunk, in through the thoracolumbar fascia, in through the lumbar spine. So now we have the diaphragm and the thoracic cavity charged with air, the abdominal contents charged with mechanical pressure that's supporting all of our spine. And this is the brilliance of the human body, is that yes, we're talking about breathing, and yes, we're talking about an exchange of gas, but the body takes that and does so much more with it, and that's the brilliance of biology. So that's hoop tension. We can create hoop tension by virtue of the diaphragm pushing down, it pushes out laterally, and then if we contract the abdominal wall, we can create a tight network of stability, functional stability, mechanical stability and support as it relates to stabilizing our pelvis, stabilizing our lumbar spine, stabilizing the entire spinal column, essentially. The last thing I'll say is that think of the diaphragm, the respiratory diaphragm, as a teepee. Right? So a teepee basically tents and it just drapes to a broad element as it reaches the ground. But on the top of the teepee, it has kind of a central access point, right? An apex. And that apex is called the central tendon. It's the superior attachment of the diaphragm itself as it tents down below and attaches to the bottom parts of your ribs. But the top part, the apex, that central tendon, if you follow that anatomy, if you follow that line of structure up, it goes from the apex, the central tendon, and then if you follow it up high enough, that central tendon actually becomes the jacket around your heart, and that's called the pericardium. So when you contract your respiratory diaphragm, and when it pulls down on that central tendon will pull tight, and will pull the jacket around your heart so that that jacket becomes more tight around the heart. So the pericardium can be pulled by your diaphragm so that it essentially gets tighter closer to the heart and then relaxes. Tighter closest to the heart and then relaxes with every cycle of breath. Now think about why that might be important if you're the heart. If you're the heart and you wear a jacket and your heart muscle and your goal is to beat and is to contract and push and pump blood, you're a pump. And you're pumping blood into the system. You have 3 pumps. Systemically, oxygenated blood. You pump to the lungs, which is deoxygenated blood, and you pump to your heart muscle itself, which is called coronary circulation. So you got 3 pumps. And those are going to be aided by the jacket around your heart, squeezing and helping you as the heart pump blood, because what's around you is helping you squeeze, essentially. So there is a link between, in this case, respiration and even indeed the heart, which is fascinating. One of the last things here in terms of the other considerations of respiration is around gas exchange as well. So when we think about expression and knowledge and exposure of gas exchange, or let's say the nature of gas that we have in our body, within the heart itself, coming out of the left ventricle, there's the aortic arch, which is the main structure, the main vessel coming out of the heart. But in that particular structure, it's an arch, there are chemoreceptors. They're little receptors that sense blood chemistry. And if we're exercising, doing our high intensity exercise, and we start to produce a lot of lactic acid, that's acidosis, essentially, it's hydrogen ion. And when we start to produce a lot of hydrogen ion and acidosis, well, guess what? It starts to go and travel everywhere in our blood. And as it gets to the level of the aortic arch, those little receptors, those chemoreceptors, will sense, more acidosis, more hydrogen ion, more lactic acid, as it were. And it starts to say, we got to get rid of this. So what does it do? It starts to tell the heart to beat faster, and it starts to tell your respiration to increase its rate. So ventilatory rate goes up as a function of what's happening in terms of blood chemistry. The more we can train the sensitivity of that, the more efficient we can become at tolerating and getting rid of fatigue, getting rid of metabolites, tolerating different levels of intense exercise or activities of life if they undulate in terms of intensity. So we look at that as a function of adaptation of respiratory muscle training. The last ones are hemoglobin and the clearance of toxins or CO2 metabolites. Hemoglobin, HGB, is the iron in your blood that carries oxygen. At the level of the muscle, it's called myoglobin. And with training, with the training effect, we increase the concentration of hemoglobin in the blood and myoglobin at the level of the muscle. Why is that good? Better for performance, because more hemoglobin and myoglobin means I can carry more oxygen. That means I can perform more work. Health-wise, if I can create and carry more oxygen, I deliver nutrients to the cell on a regular 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis, and that is good for health baseline. We want to have greater concentrations to a point of hemoglobin and myoglobin within our bodies. So these become important facets and other considerations to respiration that are critically important. So before we get to questions, I want to end off on this idea, and this is going to set up part 2, this idea of respiratory muscle training. And really what it speaks to is the idea that if I train breathing in intentional ways, specific ways, there is, like anything else, there's an adaptation to training. And we want that adaptation because it means that we can create a bunch of different responses. So in the research, in the literature, when you look up respiratory muscle training in research, what they've looked at is what happens? What happens when we train breathing? And there are a variety of different things that do happen. The first one that is pretty common is we start to create more efficiencies with the nerves and how they orchestrate muscle contractions, right? So the pattern of motor control, the pattern of how we contract is going to be more efficient. Why? Because we're going to use the diaphragm, the respiratory diaphragm, in intentional ways, right? Training. We're also going to use forced exhalation, forced inhalation, and other techniques that we're going to find out in part 2 to enhance and increase the activation of the accessory breathing muscles. And remember, accessory breathing muscles are primarily stability muscles. So when we think about the respiratory diaphragm, the main breathing muscle, with all of its helpers, right, which are all these accessory breathing muscles, and there's efficiencies within this network of muscles that act together now. What happens is we start to increase efficiencies, which means that we can actually start to spare the diaphragm because it's getting efficient. It doesn't mean it's not being used. I want to make that clear. It's absolutely still the main breathing muscle. It's now just more efficient. And when it's more efficient, there's more effectiveness, and we can spare the utility of any muscle. In this case, we're talking about the respiratory diaphragm. That is really critical to long-term health and success of our system, and certainly within the orchestra of muscles that are under the guidance of the nervous system that play the song of breathing to all these series of muscles together. We want this to occur together as an orchestra. We also, by virtue of increasing efficiencies, we can reduce things like dyspnea. And dyspnea is really just shortness of breath. That's typically associated with a disease state. And we want to subvert these disease states because all-cause mortality is a thing. And when we look at ventilatory disease, right, COPD, other aspects that inflict themselves on the respiratory system, it comes at a cost of our health. Now, we're just, hopefully exiting, a pandemic, and a pandemic that affected the respiratory system. So the idea of dyspnea, shortness of breath, is a thing. And it's a thing that many have experienced. So respiratory muscle training is not just great for performance. It's also great for health to actually push away some of these disease states or improve our health outcomes because we improve the efficiency of ventilation, right? We're more efficient at getting air in and out, getting rid of waste and metabolites, getting fresh oxygen in, and having that exchange occur at the lung level. That will increase performance, no doubt. I mean, we look at respiratory muscle training and we look at the performance of VO2. What we start to do is increase our aerobic zones because we don't cross anaerobic threshold as quickly because we can be more aerobic. Why? Because at a certain escalating rate of intensity, we can still get rid of fatigue. We can still get rid of the accumulation of what's going to cause fatigue, which will then force us across that anaerobic threshold line into more anaerobic zones. We can push that off a little further because we built more capacity to tolerate fatigue, right? That's through respiratory muscle training. We can also look at a lung function test. So FEV1 stands for forced exhalation volume in 1 second. It is a test that medical doctors will give, pulmonary specialists will give to an individual to see how much air can they blow out in 1 second. And that is typically associated, the number is calibrated to a disease state. So if my number is low, it might increase my risk of things like COPD and other respiratory issues, right? So disorders as it relates to the respiratory system. So to practice respiratory muscle training is going to increase my capacity to take in air and to get rid of air. And that is going to improve my function tests, my vital capacity, lung function tests like FEV1, et cetera. And one of the last ones, which is really critical, is the reduction in what's called cytokine release. A cytokine is a signaling molecule. It's basically a molecule that travels around the body and tells structure, tells other systems, tells other molecules basically what to do. And a cytokine comes in many forms. And it's typically, not always, but it's typically associated with immune function and growth factors. So cytokines are pretty important signaling molecules. And some of them, like interleukins, can dictate and have influence on inflammatory responses. So IL-6, which is interleukin 6, in the blood, when it circulates in the blood, it's typically, not always, but it's typically pro-inflammatory, meaning that if you have elevated IL-6 within the blood, it's associated with an inflammatory state. Now, we know that short-term inflammation can be useful for athletic gain and adaptation. Chronic inflammation is something that we want to counteract to the best of our ability. So if we've got elevated IL-6 in the blood, not so great long-term. But through respiratory muscle training, if we can reduce plasma IL-6, the interleukin 6 concentrations in the blood, we might have a positive effect on inflammation. And that is to our health benefit as well as our recovery benefit in training. So I want to make sure that I'm clear on these things because these things matter as it relates to the outcomes of health and performance, and something that we can intentionally do as it relates to improving performance through breath work. And that's critically important. For some of you who are like me, who love resources, they love to delve into the why of things, there are some great resources here, great textbooks on breathing. There's also some great research on respiratory muscle training. You can do your searches on respiratory muscle training, just put that into PubMed or any one of your search functionalities and garner some research. There's some listed here that are very useful. And it's important to understand the broad base of the mechanisms and the theory behind respiration so that in part 2, we can look at the practicality and understand conceptually and practically why this is having the effects that it's having on the body from a health perspective and a performance perspective. So with that, I want to bring Jackie back into the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Michelle.
You bet.
So that is part 1. We're going to take some time for some live questions here in just a moment, and then we'll kind of set us up a little bit for part 2, I think, here. So while you are typing in your live questions for our presenter today, Michelle Dalcourt, CEO of Institute of Motion, we've got a couple bits of contact information for you on the slide now, so feel free to stay in touch with him. Also, make sure that you take a look at some of the other courses related to this content on the ACE website. We've got a lot of great information. If you're interested in hearing from Michelle, particularly, again, we've got a lot of other courses available to you that feature him as well as along with the orthopedic exercise specialist, loaded movement training, and a movement-based approach to strength training as well. So take a look at those courses if you're interested in learning more from Michelle. And just another reminder, we do have our ACE Pro Compass. Right now, it is live on the ACE website. You can go to compass.acefitness.org, and this is a brand new, state-of-the-art area of our website that is made especially for you. There is content that will be smart content related to all of the things that you want to learn about how to navigate your business and your professional career in the health and fitness industry. So make sure you check that out. Also, we do have our ACE job board available to you right now. You can go there. That's at careers.acefitness.org, where you can upload your resume and potentially meet some employers. Also, last reminder, we have our ACE Pro Connect app. Make sure you go there as an ACE certified professional. This is a great spot for you to connect, learn, and grow with other ACE professionals. That is a free app to download on your Apple or Android device. Alrighty, we have some live questions coming in. So I'm gonna ask these questions because I feel like we're getting ready. We want to learn about the, how to apply all of this great anatomy.
Did I tease part 2 enough?
Right, yes, we've got to tease part 2. So here in part 1, we learned about the anatomy. One of the questions that came through, thank you for asking this question, is around breath sort of as a recovery technique, right? We do a sprint or a very intense HIIT workout or something that we need to recover quickly from. Let's talk about that just a little bit, how breath can be a part of that scenario.
So if this is between bouts of exercise.
Sure.
Right, okay, so if I've done a sprint and I'm doing my recovery, right, typically we want to get nervous system recovery back. Typically we would look at substrate. I want to get my fuel back in that recovery period. And let's say it's a, 1 to 4 ratio, like I've done something for a minute or 30 seconds. I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes off to recover. So I get my nervous system fatigue back. I get my substrate back. What I want to do is clear. I think the question is centering around if I want to clear metabolites because they accumulate, particularly during high intensity. During low intensity, they don't, right? I can continue on, but during high intensity, I cross that threshold, I produce a bunch of fatigue. So the body's strategies to mitigate that would be to buffer it or to expel it out or to tolerate it. So in an untrained individual, what they might want to do is produce, and we're going to learn this again, I'm teasing part 2 more, but we're going to learn about forced exhalation. So Jackie, if you and I are doing sprints and we're getting to the point where we're feeling the burn and everything's going on high alert, we want to create a forced exhalation to blow out CO2, particularly when we're detrained, deconditioned, okay? Because we can't tolerate it as much. So that would allow us to just blow out those metabolites to get rid of the fatigue so there's nothing in the way or less in the way so that we can approach our next bout of exercise, let's say 3 minutes later, and have the pathway cleared, so to speak.
Great.
Right? In a trained individual, what they're going to have is they're going to have a better ability to tolerate those fatigue. So holding CO2 in, holding carbon dioxide in, will foster more production of oxygen in terms of the receptors. So we can actually hold and produce more oxygen exchange by holding certain amounts of CO2 in with a trained individual who has tolerance on that.
Right.
So what you might find is that person is in less need of, let's say, this forced exhalation. Let's blow out all the fatigue. They can hold it in and tolerate it for a little bit longer and use that to catalyze the mobilization of oxygen to a greater degree.
Great.
Right?
Okay. So when you and I are doing those sprints and we're maybe you're trained and I'm untrained.
Okay. Probably vice versa. But
maybe you're trained and I'm untrained, but we're both doing our forced exhalation. Does our body positioning matter when we're doing those forced exhalations?
Sure. What we don't want to do is create we don't want to have what's called vertical displacement. Okay. And vertical displacement is where the ribs are going up. They will by function of it, but they're going up mostly. That's vertical displacement. Horizontal displacement is when they're going out. This is a lot of accessory breathing muscles which are going to be involved, but they're taken over. Horizontal displacement, right, which is the ribs going out, is where the main breathing muscle still gets to be the main breathing muscle, which is a respiratory diaphragm. So postures like putting your hands over your head, trying to breathe, that's going to accentuate the vertical displacement, which we don't want. The classic posture of right here is actually a useful one because we can lengthen the spine, we can stabilize our upper body, our torso, and our ribs against our legs. So we create a nice stable environment. And that allows deep breathing to occur so we can get air out. Right. So postures are going to be important. And what's interesting is the natural posture that our body kind of adheres to, right? It kind of defaults to is this one here, right? When we're fatigued. And that's a useful one,
Great.
right? Because it'll promote what's called horizontal displacement.
Great. So when I'm untrained and I put my hands on my knees to recover, I'm doing something good.
Then you're sandbagging me because you're actually really trained, but you're telling me. That's when you're sharking me a little bit.
Yeah, we can do that. Hands on the knees, that's a useful tip. Wonderful. So that does set us up for part 2, right, where we're going to go through those breathing exercises.
Absolutely. Yep.
Perfect. So we will look forward to part 2. Before we get there, reminder that as an ACE certified professional, you are required to earn continuing education to keep your certificate and credential up to date. So in order to purchase today's course, the live version as well as the bonus content, which includes part 2, you can go to acefitness.org/past webinars after the conclusion of the live event, and you can purchase the course. It will come with 2 hours of content along with a quiz, and once you pass the quiz, you'll earn 0.2 CECs, and that will go into your My ACE account. And as a reminder, we do have another live webinar coming up soon. This is next month, so be sure to sign up on the acefitness.org website to learn more about building healthy habits in group health coaching scenarios. So we're excited to have another wonderful presenter here, Marvin Dixon, for that one, who will be talking with us about group health coaching. And lastly, make sure to continue the conversation with us here at the American Council on Exercise in a variety of ways. Check us out on social media and let us know what you thought about today's live event. Michelle, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jackie. You had fun. Thank you.
All right, thank you for watching. And now let's get people moving.